want to welcome all of you to this webinar. My name is Tarun Jain. I am a professor at IIMA Ahmedabad, as well as chair of the Center for Management for this Management of Health Services at the Institute. So, today's webinar, it gives me great pleasure to welcome two friends to present some outstanding work and discuss it in some detail for the benefit of everyone in the community of CMHS at IIMA Ahmedabad, as well as several alumni who have also joined us today. So can everyone hear me clearly? Yeah, okay, great. So, first I'd like to welcome Professor Viswanath Pingali from IIMA Ahmedabad. So Viswanath, or Vishy as he is sort of universally known, is an economist. He teaches microeconomics and game theory at the Institute, but he's also an active researcher in healthcare markets. And so he recently published a paper along with his colleagues on policy uncertainty and behavior of foreign firms in emerging market economies. Now, the one word that is left out of that is pharmaceutical industry. And that is the context in which this research study has been placed. And so it's, I think, a fascinating topic. And congratulations, Rishi, on your publication. And we're looking forward to hearing far more about this work and the implications for both industry as well as for policy in much more detail. The second guest that I'd like to welcome today is Sudarshan Jain. So Sudarshan ji is a long-standing alumnus of IIMA Ahmedabad. He's had a distinguished career in industry, in the pharmaceutical industry. He was the chairman of Abbott India. And finally, now in perhaps his most important role so far, he is the Secretary General of the Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance. I think one of the most important reasons, contributions that he has made is to add to the public discussion on pharmaceutical pricing and the regulation of pharmaceutical pricing. And I think his has been a very wise and informed voice on those issues. So, so I look forward to his comments and views on this topic on today's webinar. So this is a little bit different from a typical research seminar where we have only the professor talking. But today we're very fortunate that we'll have two distinguished speakers on this topic. So without much more time, let's just get started. We have a healthy number of audience members here, and of course the talk itself is being recorded and will be posted on the Institute's YouTube channel in due course. So I'll tell you what. So we have 1 hour. So the way we'll organize this 1 hour is perhaps have 20 minutes. Vishy, is that sufficient time to discuss the research? So 20 minutes to talk about the research, perhaps 15 to 20 minutes with Sudarshanji's comments, and then we'll open up the floor to any questions that people have. So we're more than happy to have questions from the audience and responses from our guests. So without much more ado, so Vishy, floor is all yours, and I will be muting myself, but I'll be staying on camera.
Thank you, Tarun, for that great introduction. I don't know if I deserve it or not, but thanks nevertheless. And Sudarshanji, thanks also for joining this particular talk. And yes, I think welcome to all of you. And thanks for joining, for listening to my research. I can recognize a few of my past students, Pranav, Seema, Gopi, Vishnu is working with me right now. There are quite a few names. I'm sorry if I can't recognize all the names here, but very good to see you all. So let me get started on what we have in mind. By the way, this paper is a culmination of a set of talks / discussions I've had with people in pharmaceutical industry, including Mr. Jain. I'm sure he'll remember these discussions we've had when the government of India came up with the drug price control order, where they were starting to cap the prices of drugs, even for those drugs whose patents have expired, and therefore are, heavily in competition from various players. So Sudarshanji worked a lot on some of these drug price control order related molecules, and during some of these discussions, it got me thinking on the welfare implications of this DPCO, as it is popularly known as. And I think I'm also grateful to him for arranging the data, for being able to perform this research, and therefore I mean, it's only apt that Sudarshan is the discussant along with me for this very important topic. So let me get on with this. So what is it that we're trying to say? Well, there is policy and there is policy uncertainty. Now, how do firms react to policy? A lot of research has been done on this. A lot of discussion has happened on this. But how do firms react to policy uncertainty? What do I mean by policy uncertainty? There may be certain changes into the policy that are least expected by the industry. So that's exactly what we're going to exploit in this paper. And we're going to show how experience matters in dealing with policy uncertainty. Now, as a part of my job, one of the things that I do very frequently is to talk to several companies, especially multinationals, and executives from multinationals. And the things that I keep on telling them is that if you want to compete in a developing economy, it's not correct for you to impose your managerial practices on developing economies. Instead, you should actually try to imbibe the practices that are prevailing in the developing world. So that's going to be the message of this particular paper. And why are my slides not moving? Yeah. So the main motivation actually comes from this very interesting quote by Vijay Shekhar Sharma, the founder of Paytm. Maybe I should change it now, but nonetheless, what he is arguing is that whatever happens on the ground, whatever changes happen in the government policy space, is much more aware than his foreign counterparts, and that gives him the unique advantage. So that's going to be a very interesting theme around which we're going to talk. What are the few research questions? What happens when firms face with policy uncertainty? Now, the more important question is, what are the characteristics or what is the impact of policy uncertainty on the firms that are native versus foreign? Now, here is where we're going to juxtapose this entire thing. As I said, the drug price control order came into existence in early 2010. And like most government policies that you know of, this one became public news even before the policy has actually been implemented. Much more before the government made this announcement, but the policy was there. So therefore, the pharma companies in some sense were prepared for facing this particular shock called DPCO, drug price control order. I'm not saying that DPCO was not detrimental, but the DPCO is definitely something that they anticipated, and we call this as an anticipated shock. Now, DPCO has an interesting caveat in its writing, right? It's called paragraph 19 because it's literally the paragraph 19 of the order. And this DPCO, in this paragraph 19 says that unless, along with the above mentioned molecules whose prices will be regulated, if the government of India feels that there are other molecules which are of public importance, they will feel free to impose price restrictions on these. And such a paragraph 19 was imposed on a few molecules, especially in the cardiovascular segment. Somewhere around 2013, much after DPCO was passed. Now, this is something that I could tell you by talking to a lot of pharmaceutical companies. This has caught the pharmaceutical companies completely unawares. Now, you have two players in the pharmaceutical markets, the ones who are homegrown talents, the ones who are coming from abroad. The ones from abroad being Pfizer, Abbott, GSK, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the ones that are in India being the Dr. Reddy's, Sun, Cipla's, everything of the world, the Indian companies, Lupins and MCures of the world, essentially, Torrent, et cetera, et cetera. So what we try to do in this paper is look at the period where paragraph 19 has been implemented and see whether the reaction of the foreign firms and the domestic firms has been identical or not. And if the difference is, and if the reaction is different, then we attribute it to the fact that these are foreign firms which are not able to withstand policy uncertainty robustly. Now, the second part of the research that we actually look at is, do experienced firms react to policy uncertainty less drastically when compared to not so experienced firms? For instance, Abbott is a firm that has been in the country since long time. Whereas there are some new upstarts which are very mature foreign firms, by the way, but have come to India in the recent periods in time. And our argument has been that the firms which have been in India for the longest period of time, namely firms which have spent time in India which have been in India prior to 1995. 1995 is this year where we had to, adapt to product patenting. So that's the crux year in every sense of the word. The firms that have been before 1995 and the firms that have been entering Indian market after 1995, we actually noticed that the reaction of the foreign firms that have entered pre-1995 is much less robust, much less drastic when compared to firms that have entered in 2000, post-2000, 1995. So that's the main message of our entire paper. It is that in order to withstand policy uncertainty, multinationals have to look beyond imposing the rules and regulations that they've had in their home country, especially while operating in the Indian markets. That is one of the main reasons why, Tarun, if the title does not carry the word pharmaceutical markets, because pharmaceutical becomes a context, whereas the research question is broadly policy uncertainty. Make sense? So just to kind of give you a bit of a heads up as far as policy, as far as Indian markets is concerned, unlike the rest of the world, India follows what is called as branded generics. The meaning of this is that if you go to the US or Europe, for instance, nobody ever writes the brand name of the medicine on the prescription pad. It's only the name of the molecule that is written on the prescription pad. For instance, I don't think you'll see a glycomet on a prescription pad. You'll only see metformin on a prescription pad. Metformin being the name of the chemical, and glycomet being the brand manufactured, one of the brands of metformin that is present. Now, what is happening as a result of it is that in the US and Europe, you do not see the concept of medical representatives for the drugs whose patents have expired. Whereas in the Indian market, you particularly see this concept of medical representatives even for the drugs whose patent has expired. Therefore, while a Bertrand competition is likely to be the nature of competition as far as the American and the European market is concerned, something like a hoteling will be the right argument as far as the Indian pharma market is concerned. Just to let you know, there's a bit of a product differentiation purely created by detailing exercises in some sense. My colleagues, Chirantan Chatterjee and a friend, Kensuke Kubo, and I have written something about it in EPW in 2014. Right? So how is this drug price control order working? Imagine there are 5 molecules of metformin, B1, B2, B3, 5 brands of metformin, B1, B2, B3, B4, selling 500 mg potency. How is the price of metformin 500 fixed? Take the simple average of all 5 of them and say that this is the price that is prevailing in the market from tomorrow. The maximum price that you could charge in the market would be this. Now, there is a very interesting study that you actually notice here. There are several problems with this, if you think about it. First of all, 250 gram metformin is not price regulated. So the doctor was more likely to tell you, do goli khale, like something like a Sholay dialogue, if you will, right? But nonetheless, this is a very interesting argument. Combination drugs have become very, very popular as a result of it. I mean, and there's another interesting thing. As I said before, the news leaked before, and there's a McKinsey study in which I was also interviewed at some point in time, where they've completely shown that a few days before the price restriction was coming to place, all the prices of the drugs have actually increased. And as a result of it, when the average price was computed, it was much higher than the earlier. So therefore, as you teach in a standard microeconomic theory, when you impose price restrictions in a market which is fairly close to perfectly competitive markets, you're going to have a welfare loss in every sense of the word, right? Then I think the next one, as I said, is this entire argument that we saw in terms of some of the firms who are more expensive trying to go out. They were not allowed to go out, but the whole point is, I mean, as per the restriction, they're not allowed to go out, but they stop marketing their products. So nobody is going to prescribe their particular brand. So therefore, possibly high quality products are going away. Low quality products may still remain in the market. So therefore, to me, the welfare effects of DPCO are not yet clear. Right? So therefore, in the interest of time, let me move on. Paragraph 19, as I said, this came as a rude shock to the market, especially rosuvastatin, for instance, one of the drugs, where the government basically said that along with atorvastatin, which was DPCO drug, rosuvastatin will also be price controlled. Now, several multinationals, as well as the Indian pharma companies, were marketing rosuvastatin, and therefore for them it was a massive shock. What is our argument? Our argument is that all the foreign companies' sales of rosuvastatin went down significantly, whereas the Indian company sales continue to remain so. But whereas for atorvastatin, the reaction from the Indian firm and the foreign firms has not been that different. That is what we're trying to argue. We're not saying the DPCO had no impact. All we're saying is that DPCO had similar impact on the Indian firms and the foreign firms. Whereas when it comes to Para 19, foreign firms have suffered greater reaction than the domestic firms, right? So I think I've already explained these. So therefore, in the interest of time, I'll just quickly touch upon the literature. You know, why should firm react to anticipated policy changes? The answer really, technically speaking, would be sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium. Any backward induction logic will tell you how the firms would actually react to anticipated policy changes. Why should foreign firms react differently to domestic firms in the light of policy uncertainty? Here is where a seminal study by Palepu and Khanna, which is, I believe, Strategy Management Journal 2010, comes out. The institutional structures in the developing economies are still nascent. And in every sense of the word, that's the reason why they're called developing economies, because the institutional structures, be it the justice system, be it the patenting system, be it the intellectual property, all of these are still nascent in shape. So therefore, the policies required to tackle an emerging scenario are way different from policies required to tackle an established scenario. So therefore, without necessarily getting into further details on literature, the whole argument is there's enough literature to tell us from both strategy and marketing that the familiarity of the market, however uncertain the terrain might be, ends up having a greater say in how firms would eventually adapt to policy uncertainty. So therefore, what is our first hypothesis that we actually say? Foreign firms reaction to anticipated policy changes is not more adverse than the reaction by the domestic firms. Whereas compared to domestic firms, foreign firms must react much more adversely to policy uncertainty. So this is the hypothesis that we end up positing. So what is our third hypothesis? The third hypothesis comes a lot from the literature that was discussed both in economics and strategy on learning by doing. Firms make strategic mistakes, they learn, they adapt, and they move on. Now, there's a very famous Journal of Political Economy paper by Lionel Benkert in 2001, who argues, especially in terms of repeated games as a measure of filling gaps in firms' knowledge base. Solomon and Wu, I can go into Peng, etc., who have been talking about organizational learning and knowledge management as a reason for how firms learn. So therefore, what is our third hypothesis? Compared to newer entrants, for foreign firms with greater experience in emerging economies react less adversely to policy uncertainty. Tarun, I hope I have 5 more minutes to completely wind up the discussion.
Sure.
Great. So how do we test hypothesis 1 and 2? Straightforward regression model. The sales of firm I for brand B during the month T is our dependent variable. What are our independent variables? Product diversity, the number of other products that the firm sells, and pre-price control market share. Why are we using these two? Product diversity will tell you that the firm is how much the firm is dependent on the DPCO and para 19 molecules. And market share and pre-price control market share will also tell you how robust the firm is in terms of its standing. So these are our two controls. The variables of interest are dummy for anticipated shock, dummy for unanticipated shock. That means in the periods where DPCO is in prevalence, the dummy for anticipated shock takes value 1 and 0. The dummy for unanticipated shock takes value 1 and 0 in the time period where there is where para 19 was in existence. Dummy for foreign firm, whether a firm is foreign or not, takes value 1 and 0. Now, whether a molecule is DPCO molecule or not, whether a molecule is a paragraph 19 or not, those are the dummy variables that we would use. Make sense? So what is the identification method? We use a straightforward regression method, fixed effects regression. We use, that's also because of Hausman test and everything else that we conduct tells us very clearly. Now, what is the estimation strategy? The estimation strategy we follow is difference and difference and difference, D and D method. So therefore, the reaction two anticipated shock can be obtained from this from this variable, foreign firm multiplied by DPCO molecule multiplied by DPCO time period. How is it that a firm is reacting? How is it that a foreign firm is reacting differently for a DPCO molecule after DPCO is implemented? That's the whole argument. And for unanticipated shock, how is a foreign firm reacting to para-19 molecule during the time period that para-19 has been implemented? Those are the few things. Our hypothesis 1A would make sure that the first variable of interest is not significant, whereas the second variable of interest is going to be statistically significant. Pictorially speaking, this is what it is. This is what it is. The green line indicates a strong, how do I say, para-19 implementation. You can see at this point in time, there's a slight blip, there's a slight drop in the sales. Whereas for domestic firms, there does not seem to be any such thing. What is our regression result telling us? These are the two variables of interest. The first variable, minus 0.04, he has a standard error of 0.05. It's not statistically significant at all, which basically tells us, that when it comes to anticipated shock of a DPCO molecule, the foreign firm reaction is not drastically different from the domestic firm reaction. The next variable of interest is minus 0.19, which is statistically significant at 99.99% significance level. And what does that tell you? Everything else being equal, when an unanticipated shock has come to the market, foreign firms on an average sell around 19% less than their domestic counterparts. That will be the interpretation of that particular statement. Now it will tell us essentially, and it is very robust result. We've tried several specifications, but I'm only reporting fixed effect and random effect coefficients here. But nevertheless, across the various specifications that we run, this number 0.19 and the negative sign has been fairly robust, except for a small change here and there. How do we test hypothesis number 3 about new entrants and old entrants? Sorry, I misspoke earlier. New firms are classified as firms that have made entry post 2005. Old firms are classified as the firms that have entered pre-2005. Why is 2005 important? While 1995 was the year in which India was asked to adapt to product patenting, they were given a decade to adapt to the system. So 2005 is when the product patenting officially launched. That is when you saw many multinational giants like Pfizer and all have started operating in India in a significant way. So what is the important coefficient that we are interested in? New foreign firm multiplied by post para-19 multiplied by the fact that this is a foreign firm in the first place. So again, you can see this is the sale. You can make out that as far as foreign new entrant is concerned, sales have just tanked following para-19 onset completely. And that's exactly what a regression result kind of shows. Age low, para-19 period, foreign firms, they're selling significantly less, they're actually getting out. So that's where I think our results are. What do these results tell us? Clearly two things. Domestic firms, or maybe firms in developing economies, if I were to generalize it, this is a bit of a stretch, I understand. Domestic firms face policy uncertainty significantly better than foreign firms. And the second thing that I think we can say with a larger degree of confidence is that foreign firms that have come to the Indian market are adapting slowly but surely. They're adapting to the regime of policy uncertainty. What are the implications for policy and practice? Well, I mean, from the policy side, one has to be very careful. So I think any standard microeconomic theory will tell you low prices are not necessarily great for the consumers, because there's also lesser incentive for the firms to produce. From a firm strategy standpoint, well, basically hire local talent to face local situations. Don't try to impose foreign practices in the Indian market. Other thing about policy is that policy uncertainty does create non-level playing field in a world which is increasingly globalized. That could act as a major deterrent for foreign firms to make even an entry into the Indian market. Well, there are a few arguments that I actually have for future work. We are continuing to work on this particular topic, mostly from the point of view of foreign exposure, Indian firms which have significant exposure to foreign lands, probably react differently from the domestic firms which have zero exposure, for instance, to foreign lands. That's a research that is in progress currently, but that's where I'll stop. I've been given 20 minutes and I think I'm done with that. So I also see some questions, but before that, let's ask Sudarshanji to make a few comments and I think we can take questions. Sudarshanji, over to you.
So let's just transition to Sudarshanji right away.
So thank you very much, Professor Vishy. And I will not have slides, but I've been part of the events which Vishy is describing. And I remember during the time he was writing this, he opted for to be at IIMA, and we provided the data support through AVEX. And I used to enjoy the discussion with Vishy. It has been at different stages. I will call this as a landmark paper. And this today's discussion also very, very important, Tarun, that you decided that let the discussion because it will open up a lot of new ideas. Congratulations, Vishy, and thanks, Tarun, for this step. It is also an important step as we are starting Chindal School of Public Policy. So these kind of conversations, these kind of discussions will be a great input for policy shaping. So 3 areas I will cover. I don't have the slides, but I will talk through the events which I'm going through and went through during the time. 3, this research. That's the one area which I wanted to cover, Tarun and Vishy. Second is implications of the research. What are the future research based on the paper what Vishy has written? I'm not a researcher, I'm a practitioner, and it's a privilege for me today with 2 outstanding researchers of IIMA being there today. So it's my privilege. So I will focus on these 3 areas. At the moment, if we see many of the policy shaping initiatives, we tend to lose evidence because the bureaucrats keep on changing. Policy is shaped. There is little work which is done to see the outcomes of that and decide what should be done next to shape and come out with policy. So research is very, very important. And the use of research in the policy shaping is important, point number 1. Point number 2 is, given the fact that we are talking now of School of Public Policy and CMHS, if the research is done in some of the questions, there are a lot of questions which are coming through COVID, there are a lot of positive dimensions of the policy which are taking place. If we can have academic inputs on the policy shaping, and I also have seen Professor Tarun participating in one of the seminars in Delhi and with Niti Aayog, that move by IIMA is a welcome move because there is a need for evidence as far as policy shaping is concerned. And there is a realization in the government that evidence will lead to a better policy shaping. That's point number 2, and use of academic institutions moving forward. Third is this work. I will, as Professor Vishy rightly said, policy uncertainty and behavior of foreign firms. This is not only applicable to pharma industry, although the taken of pharma industry, but it has got deep implication for the investment climate in the country. Professor Vishy, you will remember at that time, also Vodafone case was going on, and there was a retrospective taxation which was put in. So everyone was trying to connect Vodafone as well as this, that there was a shocking element as far as the policy changes are concerned, and how does everyone respond? So Vodafone on one this side, and Abbott has also bought Piramal business. So what is the implication of? So we were also trying to dabble with that issue. So how does it has an impact? That is also a very important question, although that part has policy stability, policy got a lot of implication as far as investment climate is concerned. So it is a very important question, and use of evidence in the policy is very, very important. because at that particular moment, Abbott had bought Piramal, and there was first DPCO 2013 came in, and Abbott being a foreign company, our understanding of that 2013 environment was. So we thought that we have to improve our understanding, and what are the areas which we took for understanding was very, very important. As you rightly said, first is the Indian management is not able to, of the foreign firm, is not able to understand the policy implication. So they respond differently. And second is the global management, because when they hear from the Indian management that this policy change has happened, the global management will ask, why didn't you anticipate this? And why are you giving a surprise and shock to us? So in emerging market, how do we operate when we are not clear about the very, very difficult for Indian management to justify the foreign management that how do we deal with this policy issue? Where foreign Indian companies, since they are used to these changes, they are able to respond better. So in this kind of case, first was DPCO 2013, and then come Para 19, which is a shock because all the sudden 108 product prices are reduced. And you can see the work which Prof. Vishy has done, which he says clearly, and his work shows clearly, that domestic companies were able to respond it relatively better compared to the Indian companies, compared to the foreign companies. And foreign companies also, I will give foreign companies which have got experience in India for a period of time, and he has used the date to describe who are late entrants and who are early entrants. Now, early entrants, they can respond to that thing better because you can see from the graph that the sales of the late entrants declined much faster because they didn't know how to manage that environment. They responded very adversely, and they have not been able to take advantage of that fact. Now, that's hypothesis. More and more one looks at it as a practitioner, I can say that is an important hypothesis. And as an implication for that, more importantly, I will focus on implication, Tarun, because we took a lot of steps. I used to have the opportunity to discuss with Vishy during that time, and he was talking about the early results. So what some of the good companies have done, foreign companies, is they got the local talent which specializes in policy. Like say maybe before the time, Abbott didn't have a government affairs team in India, but today I can say Abbott has built the strongest team as far as Indian operations are concerned. Companies, they understand that regulatory environment is important, and they have strengthened that team in this country. Second is, in the emerging market, you have to have a team which understands the changes in policy, so you are able to respond it better, because policy has got a very important role in some of the industry, like pharma industry or any industry for that matter. I will talk about that later. So build the team with the local talent. Second is, some of the companies have bought the Indian company, like Abbott bought Piramal business to have the understanding of the Indian environment and Indian regulation. Driver for Abbott buying Piramal business at a valuation which was unheard of at that time, 10 times the sales, 30 times the profit, because they were buying a talent and the knowledge base of a company which understands the emerging market better. Point number two. Point number three is many of the companies or joint ventures with the company to understand the local environment better, because that is very, very important. So companies like say MST, that maybe some of the discussion which Prof. Vishy has been taking, alliance with Sun Pharma, Boehringer Knoll and Boehringer Ingelheim entered into strategic alliances with Lupin. So you enter into strategic alliance to improve your understanding of regulatory environment, and you can leverage the potential of that particular market. That's the third. So voluntary licensing arrangement, strategic alliances, that becomes the third route as far as the whole thing is concerned. And fourth is, like say the foreign companies, when they come to India, they have to realize that there is more volatility in those kind of emerging economies, because the institutional framework is nascent for developing the policy. So they take into account and they do scenario analysis. very well that if this is the kind of scenario, what we'll do, if this is the kind of scenario, what we'll do, and they take the risk into account when the policy planning is done. So these are the various mechanisms, because it is important for every company to build that knowledge-based, learning base to understand the policy environment. I will give examples of 3 companies here. Abbott versus other multinational companies in India. So Abbott, what not part of a multi, Abbott is part of IPA because they think Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance have got a better understanding of the policy environment. We will become part of IPA as an association. So that is one area. Nordisk and Eli Lilly, if you see 2 foreign companies, Novo Nordisk has got better understanding of Indian market because they have strategic alliance. Strategic alliance with a company which knows Indian market better. You build a strategic alliance with another company which is Abbott. So they have a strategic vulnerabilities or the vicissitudes of the Indian market better or emerging market better. I will give an example also from a consumer industry. So that's why when Vishy writes this paper, he's not talking of pharma industry, he's talking overall environment. So the company like Unilever today is able to understand and manage the emerging market much better compared to P&G or other companies, because they have got a better learning base, and hence the understanding of Indian market is relatively better. So it is not only pharma, it is the overall environment which becomes very, very important. So the clear question is, you have to have a learning mechanism to understand the market where you are operating, and hence you will be able to leverage the market much better. Going to the next question, maybe future research question. With the COVID work, the vulnerability in the policy and the changing in policy environment are as high in the US market as in the Indian market. So are the emerging market or developing market and developed market, is the policy stability is the same, or there are other geopolitical which are bringing about the change? That's the one research question, which is very, very important. And hence, when an Indian company go to US market, they should also create a framework to understand that market, because many of the Indian companies are multinational companies. And hence, policy has got an important dimension to capitalize. The question is developing and developed markets. So point number 1. Has market. Very, very important question, because if I look at the Indian pharma industry,
okay, I think your voice is cutting off.
Sudarshanji, I think your last point did not come through because the connection was not clear. So request you to please repeat yourself on the last. So why don't we ask a couple of questions? So, there's Gopi Krishna Panikar. So he has asked a question on applicability of this research and the implications on other areas. So why don't I allow him to talk and.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jain. Thank you, Professor Jain. Hi, Professor. Just wanted to know that, in your study, you had, I think you had evaluated the cardiovascular segment. So I was wondering, specifically with respect to the oncology segment, which also has a fair amount of price control, but where probably the patients who need these medications, they have very limited agency in considering alternatives. And what would any remarks on what could have been the potential impact in that segment?
Yeah, so interesting, Gopi. First of all, I believe that even in an oncology segment, you would have seen that the foreign firms which are manufacturing non-patented drugs, right? Remember that these DPCO and para-19 molecules are off patent. None of the novel molecules as of now has come under either DPCO or para-19. So therefore, you know that the implications of those would be much lower, in the sense that the number of molecules that have come under price restriction would have been lower. So therefore, even by extension, even if the number of molecules is large enough, I would actually argue that for all the molecules that have come under price restriction, there are alternative Indian therapies that are available. So foreign production might have stopped, but the Indian production has not. So therefore, the market is being filled. The question that becomes crucial out here is what are the firms that are stopping, and whether there is any quality issues involved in the firms that are continuing. I don't have a great answer from my research on that, but I think the literature review that I had done and a couple of other things tell me that there are problems out there. So therefore, while the high quality drugs are going away, if the low quality drugs are substituting for, then there's a problem. I mean, Sudarshan ji wrote a very nice article in a newspaper recently on stent price controls and all that stuff. And I think he was also with Abbott when price control on stents was implemented. What we knew was that Abbott actually withdrew its fourth generation stents from India, whereas first, second, and third generation stents, both drug-eluting and non-drug-eluting stents, continue to remain in the market. The same is the story with Medtronic. By the way, the other massive, and Stryker, the other massive stent manufacturers in the country right now. Now, so therefore, if you would believe that the quality parameters are identical across all stent manufacturers, then there is probably no issue. But otherwise, there are massive welfare implications. And that's where I would stop. Gopi, I hope I answered some part of your question.
So Sudarshan, we had missed your final comments because we could not hear you.
So sorry, Tarun. In fact, the way I was saying that I was talking about some of the questions for the future research, and one of the points which I was saying is that Indian companies, when they go global, whether it is US market or European market, the policy dimension understanding is very, very important. And with post-COVID world, the turbulence in the policy is there both in emerging market as well as developed market, because there are other factors which are taking into consideration for the policy volatility. Because I examine US market as well, and I tell my Indian companies that have a very good understanding of that market, either through building the local talent there or getting associated with some of the companies there. So that logic, maybe one of the question is, how is the policy varying in developed and developed market? Point number one. And point number two is the role of policy in shaping the direction of the industry. So if you see two work which has been done, basically NASSCOM is a great example how the policy has shaped in development of that industry. And second is the pharma industry. It is a good research question that understanding of the policy environment helps to lead better performance of the institution of that industry and also the companies operating in that industry. I will stop here and we will leave it to question and answer session.
Yeah. So thank you so much for these great comments. I think I've certainly learned a lot in today's session. So thank you to both of you. But I'll, at this point, open it up to the audience. If there are any subsequent questions, either clarifying questions or you want to have any kind of question, this is right now a good point to ask. Perhaps raise your hand and I will unmute you in order to discuss.
I thought I'll just have a follow-up to the remarks by Professor Pingali. And thank you for the response, Professor. I think understanding how it's good to know that the oncology segment would also see a similar move in that area. Just wanted to know that with all these efforts at price controls for generics and branded generics, is there a consideration that bioequivalence would be considered as an indicator for determining the pricing amongst products with respect to quality?
So Gopi, all the generic drugs are approved based on bioequivalence, and all the biologics are approved based on biosimilar restrictions, right? But then the argument that still remains is that how, I mean, so I don't know. I mean, without being political, I mean, I just keeping the political correctness aside for a second. How much do you believe the regulatory authority at the at the end of the day? There are studies that have been published which basically show the varying level of API, active pharmaceutical ingredient in molecules across various companies. But typically, the doctor argument has always been that you should always stick to a particular brand of medicine and don't change brands because there is a different level of API content across various brands of the same molecule, etc., etc. I don't know how much true each of them is, but nonetheless, even if there's a bit of a truth in this, I'm afraid bioequivalence in theory is right. In practice, it may be failing us. I hope I answered that question.
Yes, you did, Professor. Thank you.
Maybe I would like to build on this. I would like to build on this is like, what is the current price policy says that any product which is more than 1% market share, do the average of all that and come out with the pricing of the national list of essential medicine. That's the way the pricing policy works. We are not talking of quality at this particular moment. We are talking only of averaging. Now, different products may have different pricing parameters. Like there's a plant which is US FDA approved, and there's a plant in Louisiana which is making products locally without much quality standards. So the job of the policy maker at that particular moment, they are not making distinction as far as that area is concerned, whereas I is all products market, when the generics are prescribed, they go through US FDA audit, and that's why they can be marketed. So we are also taking a position that ICH approved product, which is guarantee on quality, and then we can talk of the price harmonization. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, great. So next question is from Anshuman. Then I'll take Alok and then Rajkishore Sahu. So let me unmute Anshuman. So Anshuman, can you please ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Professor J. Professor Viswanath, my question is to you, since as a non-specialist in this field. So something I was wondering is, so since the primary intended welfare purpose of capping the price of the medicine would be to increase patient benefits, at least in welfare state. So based on your findings, where you have showed that some foreign firms have not reacted in an efficient manner to a sudden change in policy. So could you also comment on what this says about the intended customer? Is it fair to say that it necessarily is detrimental for the final patient, or is it? Do we even argue that it's actually opposite to that?
Anshuman, interesting question. I think I said that the foreign firms react differently. Now the question is, there are dynamic consequences. I don't answer in this paper, but there are dynamic consequences in the sense that most of the R&D currently in pharma world is done by foreign firms. Very few Indian firms actually have high-level R&D capabilities, right? So therefore, if price controls like this, and more importantly, forget price controls for a second, but the policy uncertainty that could involve uncertainty around your patenting regimes and all that stuff, if at all that increases significantly, and as a result, the foreign firms stop launching their brands in India, then I think you have a problem. Interesting case in point being, there's a paper in Health Affairs that came out in 2011. I believe Ian Coburn and a bunch of his co-authors who showed that out of 140 molecules that have been approved by US FDA, only 100 or 90 or so have been launched in India. The rest of them have not been. A couple of my students have shown it very clearly that the market for these 40, 45 really does not exist in the Indian context. So therefore, to that extent, it's okay. But you knew that in the pre-1995 era, many of the drugs that have been launched abroad have not been launched in India because of the extreme volatile policy uncertainty regime. So therefore, while in this particular case of these generic medicines, it might not have suffered. And again, that's only a might, okay? I mean, that's a hope that I'm trying to say at this point in time. The policy uncertainty as such will affect foreign firms, and foreign firms who are also innovators at this stage may not launch the novel molecules in the country. That I'm sure you'll agree with me is detrimental to public welfare.
Yes, sir. So I do. So from the personal point of view, it does make sense that a policy shock has unintended consequences, and that unintended consequences can harm the patients.
Only one point I would like to add here is policy, when it is decided, the national interest is very, very important. It is not that, says, if I understand rightly, that there has to be policy stability policy should take care of needs and the with stakeholders. I would like to quote a point direction. Take the case of vaccines. Yes, there was a policy. One of the multinationals wanted to come, but they wanted the change in the policy to suit their direction. But the Indian government said that we will live with that policy, what we have in this country, and we will not align the policy to suit the Western countries. The product was not launched. At the end of the day, and that's why the point which I'm raising for future research is policy shaping in the changed context of COVID becomes very, very important. And that's a very important step which the Indian government took and it was able to take care of the vaccination needs of the country.
Okay, great. So let me now get to Alok Mishra, and then I'll take the final question from Raj Kishore Shah. Dr. Raj Kishore.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to comment and caution a bit. And the context is that I spent maybe half my life in pharmaceuticals. Actually, I worked very closely with Sudarshan Jain and another 20 years in medical devices. And during the research, I saw, at least from what was said, a clubbing of medical devices and pharmaceuticals in sort of the same way. And I would caution against that because there's one basic difference between pharmaceuticals and devices. The difference is a pharmaceutical generic and the research companies, innovators generic are pretty much the same. When you swallow a tablet, it is the same. And as far as it dissolves and the bioavailability or bioequivalence is there, the patient is fine. But in medical devices, what happens is the quality of the outcome is not in the device because there's a huge amount of training which is involved. And unfortunately, this is a training which is not something which can be given in medical device in medical colleges because as and when new devices come out, like when stents came out or when robotics will come out, there's a huge amount of training which the manufacturer has to do. So the cost of goods is actually not in the product. And therefore, if you had a generic device versus the original company's device, the cost structures of the companies are very different because most of the cost is actually in the training. So something like stent is fine because by the time the stent price reduction was done, a lot of doctors had been trained. And I can say that because I was in the company who trained a lot of these doctors. But if you do the same for newer devices, chances are that the outcomes will be quite different if the multinational loses interest in the product because of the price reason. So what I'm trying to say is when you do the research, it's not just looking at when companies came in, but the amount of, say, training they do, especially when it comes to more complicated products. And I guess the same will apply with the newer type of, genetic gene modification products and all which are coming. There may be a huge amount of things involved there. And the fact that these products need a lot of training. The second aspect to this is still a lot of devices are imported. And because they're imported, the product in India is pretty much the same,
So, Alok,
even from a packaging. Yeah.
If I can respond quickly.
Yeah.
So the paper is not about medical devices at all. We are only speculating about medical devices based on what we found in the pharma market. The entire data crunching, theory building, and proposals are completely only applicable at the stage to pharma markets. And there's one more market that we actually found where somewhat similar one is, and there's a work going on it. So therefore, I won't comment on it more than anything else. But the industry is mutual funds. So we see some kind of a similar one. So therefore,
I understand that, Prof. The only thing is, since you mentioned stents and then you mentioned Medtronic, I wanted that clarification.
Understood.
Because stents are not pharmaceuticals.
Fair enough point. Actually,
the second,
this is more, please.
The second part, the pressure on multinationals and devices is much larger because, as you know, maybe 70–80% of the products used even in India today are imported. And to be fair, I see this as not changing because the newer products are still not innovated in India. So while you will have maybe 20% of the hospital supplies being made here, still there will be a huge dependence on the developed markets for this. Now, what happens in that case is because the product is essentially the same in packaging and everything as the global product, there's a huge pressure on the multinational to discontinue the product. As Mr. Jain also said that, fourth generation they did not launch here because of reference pricing. Countries like Japan, the US, and many parts of EU they look at prices across the world, and that affects the prices in those markets. So even if the multinational wanted lower prices in the emerging markets, they have certain limitations because it affects their overall global P&L. So I just thought I'll put this out. With medical devices being different, one, because they're still largely imported, and secondly, there's a huge training component, which is still done by the companies themselves, which makes a difference in what they charge.
I mean, for what it is worth, Alok, I can only say this, that, these data, unfortunately, unlike the US market where detailing data is available, the data in India is not. So therefore, to that extent, I think the regression results will suffer from the omitted variable bias, but we try accounting for it through various robustness checks, which I didn't talk about it in this talk, but I think the paper accounts for it in a significant way.
Yeah.
Thanks for the comment, though.
So I think to take away from Vishy's point, and also I see Ulash Joshi making these points in the chat box, is that there's a very important role, right? So I mean, the way in which this research took place is there is a lot of academia industry collaboration on the data end of things, where industry helps academics to gain access to very fine level data, right? And that's what enables us to actually carry out this research. Now, of course, we take sufficient safeguards to protect, say, identity of the firms or identity of the, specifics of the situation, and come up with general findings, right? So in this case, for the pharmaceutical industry, right? So not, as you rightly mentioned, the devices industry, but given, I think the important point over here is that when industry is open to collaborating with academics, then we can generate these insights, which is very difficult to do if there's no sense of open collaboration. Now, I think the other part in which we're quite open to is to listen to industry about what questions are important, right? And this is the place where, I think we've all benefited from Sudarshanji's views and perspectives, not just today, but also much in the past, many times, several times in the past, as well as, open to hearing many suggestions from people who are in the audience today about what might be sort of, insights that they would like to get. So let me just sort of wrap up. There's a final, hand up, which is Dr. Rajkishore Sahu. So Dr. Sahu, would you like to ask your question? And then I think we will call it a day.
Hello, Tarun sir, Pingali sir, and Sudarshan sir. Actually, I am a clinician. I was associated with CMHS since long. Thing is that day-to-day clinical practice, I have seen the prices of the medicines are going, like shooting up, increasing, highly increasing. And I was seeing one medicine, typically I don't want to mention the brand name. It was like 44 rupees, now it is 90 rupees. So, can you, if anything is, you can suggest the government of India to, don't increase these prices, like, so that most of the poor people are dependent on medicines. No, that's what they can't afford. Is there any kind of you can suggest to the,
So what would be either alternatives to the DPCO that you would?
That's like.
Maybe can I give a comment on this?
Yes.
Rajkishore
ji, there cannot be 100% price increase, because what the DPCO says, you can take maximum 10% price increase for decontrol.
10%.
So if you can send me the example, it will be helpful, because if you see our DPCO is very well drafted, the question is only uncertainty, which Professor Viswanath is talking about. So if you send the details, it will be helpful. Second, I will thank Alok for joining, and Ulas. Alok raised very, very valid point. And Alok, if we can get connected with you, Tarun and Vishy, it will be such a great thing, because with his experience both in pharma and medtech, it will be a great thing. And Ulas, as always, is a very great input, which is there, where he's talking of collaboration between industry, and we will try to do what best can be done, Vishy and Tarun, to get the industry input. Over to you, back to you.
Great. So I think let me just wrap up over here with first thanking our panelists, both Professor Viswanath Pingali as well as Sudarshan Jain, for participating in a very enriching discussion. For me, because I don't have a pharmaceutical background, but yet I'm interested in healthcare, this is one part of the industry which I always come to these two gentlemen to teach me about. So thank you very much again for helping me learn so much more. I hope it was also useful for the rest of you in the audience. And thank you so much for offering your suggestions, offering your questions. All of these were very helpful. We will be putting up a recording of this discussion online on YouTube. And so, in that sense, if you would like to share it or participate in a subsequent event, please let us know, and we look forward to that. So with this, let me just thank my colleagues in the center, Maya Swaminathan and Harshit Zala, for putting all the effort into. They did the real work. So thank you very much, Maya and Harshit, for the great work that you've done. Let me wrap up and say very good evening and good night to all of you.